My younger sister got pregnant by my husband while living with us and now wants me to leave so they can be a family, but now she feels cheated because my husband doesn't actually own any assets. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old and currently living in Austin, Texas, with my husband Nathan. We don't have kids, so our 3-bedroom house always had this quiet emptiness. Until one night last October, when my phone rang at 1 a.m. It was my younger sister Rachel, 28, on the other end. Her voice was trembling. I have nowhere else to go. Rachel told me that her company in Denver had just declared bankruptcy after a financial lawsuit, and she was laid off immediately. At the same time, she was hospitalized with a high fever and extreme fatigue. Doctors diagnosed her with West Nile virus, a rare but dangerous illness transmitted by mosquitoes. Hearing her frail voice through the phone, I didn't think twice. I just knew I had to bring Rachel home with me right away. When I told Nathan, he simply nodded and said, "Of course, she's family." He helped me clear out the guest room at the end of the hallway. A space that used to be his writing studio, now turned into a temporary shelter for my sister. I felt so relieved that my husband was supportive, and I told myself that once Rachel recovered and got back on her feet, everything would fall into place. Rachel moved in with us on a Monday morning. She looked frail and pale, but still managed a weak smile when I opened the door. I hugged her like I could absorb all her pain into my arms, and led her upstairs while Nathan carried her luggage behind us. What I didn't realize then was that the day I opened that door for my sister was also the day I unknowingly invited the darkest tragedy of my life. In the first few weeks, Rachel barely left her room. She lived on porridge, medicine, and sleep. I got up early to cook chicken soup, placed a thermometer by her bed, and even moved the couch near the window so she could get some sun in the mornings. Nathan would read to her in the evenings, short stories he'd written himself. His voice, deep and warm, somehow sounded gentler than I'd ever heard before. I used to stand quietly in the hallway, listening to the two of them giggle as Nathan read silly little anecdotes about married life. I thought maybe Rachel was starting to feel better, and Nathan was helping lift her spirits. But deep down, a vague sense of unease had started to take root in me, a kind of emotional imbalance I didn't yet have words for. About 6 weeks in, Rachel had almost fully recovered. She was walking on her own, eating normally, and even talking about applying for jobs again. I was happy to see her regaining her strength after everything she'd been through, and I assumed she'd soon move out and start rebuilding her own life. But every time I brought up the idea of her finding a new place, Rachel would dodge the conversation, saying rent was too expensive or that she still didn't have a stable job. One Saturday evening, I came home from the grocery store and saw the kitchen lights still on. When I walked in, I found Rachel sitting across from Nathan at the dining table. Between them was a half-empty glass of wine. They looked a bit startled, and Nathan offered a strange smile. I was just telling Rachel about a new idea for my novel, that's all. The following week, I had to fly to Chicago for 2 days to attend a business conference with a major client. Rachel said she'd take care of the house, and Nathan promised to handle the meals while I was gone. I left with complete trust that my husband and my sister would behave appropriately in my absence. What I didn't realize was that, in those 2 days, something quietly shattered, something irreparable. When I came back, the house felt strangely cold. No one greeted me at the door. No one asked if I was tired. There was no dinner waiting. Rachel gave me a tight-lipped smile, and Nathan barely glanced at me, like I was just a housekeeper who had shown up late. It felt like I'd walked into a stranger's home. And the strange part was, I was supposed to be the owner. I tried to act normal that night, but everything felt unnaturally silent. Rachel had dinner and quickly went upstairs. Nathan claimed he was stuck on a writing idea and slammed the door to his office. I sat alone at the dining table, quietly cutting into the ham I'd made before the trip, but I couldn't swallow a bite. The next morning, while making coffee in the kitchen, I overheard whispering coming from the living room. My heart started pounding as I tiptoed closer. But when I peeked in, I only saw Nathan scrolling on his phone and Rachel staring at the floor. They both looked up at me, and immediately changed the subject, like they'd just been caught in the middle of something they shouldn't have been doing. I started paying more attention to the way they interacted. Nathan's gaze lingered on Rachel longer than it should have. Rachel laughed too loudly at his jokes, even the dumb ones. One night, I heard laughter coming from the living room at 1 a.m. When I stepped out, they were sitting side by side on the sofa, so close their shoulders were nearly touching. When I asked, "Why aren't you asleep yet?" Rachel just shrugged and said, "We were talking about life philosophy." Something inside me started to boil, not because I was sure of anything, but because I was starting to lose faith in what I was seeing. I didn't want to think badly of my sister, and I certainly didn't want to doubt my husband, the man I'd shared 8 years of marriage with. But I knew that if I kept pretending not to see, I'd eventually drown in my own home. The next morning, when Rachel came down for breakfast, I looked her straight in the eye and asked gently, "Have you applied for any jobs yet?" She paused for a few seconds, then replied, "Nothing suitable yet. You know how competitive the market is these days." I nodded, but didn't mention that I had seen an interview invitation in her email, one she had never responded to. A few days later, Rachel suddenly asked Nathan and me to sit down in the living room. Her tone was so serious I thought something terrible had happened. For a second, I even thought maybe she was going to tell us she was moving out, or had found a job in another city. But what she said froze the entire room in place. "Emily, I'm pregnant." I was stunned, still trying to process that, when she continued without hesitation. "And it's Nathan's." I turned to my husband on instinct. His face went pale like paper, his eyes wide in shock. There was no denial, no, that's not true. Just a silence that killed both trust and hope. Nathan stood up like he was about to say something, then sat back down, staring at the floor like a guilty child. Rachel rested her hand on her stomach, which, I noticed, hadn't started to show, and said, "We didn't mean for this to happen, but now it has." I felt like every drop of blood had drained from my heart, leaving me cold all the way to my fingertips. "You have every right to be angry," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "But for the baby's sake, I think you should give us the house." She went on. "We want to build a decent family, a real one. And we can't do that with you here." I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but the hollow kind of laugh that escapes when you've run out of emotion. I leaned back in my chair, eyes locked on Rachel. "This house is mine, I paid for every brick in it." Nathan looked up, more lost than I'd ever seen him. And Rachel looked like she'd just been stabbed. I stood up slowly and said each word clearly. "If anyone's leaving this house, it's the two of you, not me." Rachel blinked, clearly thrown off, like she hadn't even considered the possibility of rejection. She pressed her lips together, then shook her head slightly. "I didn't think you'd be this selfish, especially when I'm pregnant." I crossed my arms, voice calm and flat. "You slept with my husband under my roof. And now you want compassion?" The room fell into a silence so deep I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Nathan still hadn't said a word. He just sat there, head down, wringing his hands like a man awaiting execution. Rachel looked at him, raising her voice. "Say something, didn't we agree on this?" Nathan finally looked up, his eyes dull and exhausted. "Rachel, I never agreed to kick Emily out of the house. And I didn't think you'd bring this up like this." I froze. Did Nathan not even know Rachel planned to drop this bomb like some kind of ambush? Rachel whipped her head toward him, fury burning in her eyes. "What the hell are you saying? You said you'd choose me." Nathan slowly shook his head, voice dry and raspy. "I never promised that. You created that idea on your own." The air between them began to crack. And I just stood there, watching this absurd drama unfold in my own living room. I gripped the arm of the chair and took a deep breath. A strange calm washed over me. "That's enough," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was final. "Rachel, pack your things. And Nathan, if you have even a shred of decency left, you'll know it's time for you to go too." Rachel screamed, "I'm the one who's pregnant. You can't just throw me out like this." I replied coldly, "You had enough strength to climb into my husband's bed. I'm sure you can walk out the door." Nathan closed his eyes, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, I saw him look small. Rachel started sobbing, collapsing to the floor, hands on her belly. A scene I couldn't tell was genuine or staged. "You can't do this to me! I'm your sister, and this is your niece or nephew." I stepped closer, staring straight into her eyes. "When you betrayed me, you stopped being my sister." I turned and walked upstairs, into the guest room. Opened the closet. Pulled out the 2 old suitcases Rachel had brought with her. I shoved her clothes in without folding, without sorting, because I no longer had the strength to be kind. When I dragged the suitcase downstairs, Rachel was still sitting there, her face flushed, tear-streaked. Nathan stood up without saying a word and walked into the bedroom. A few minutes later, he came out with his own suitcase in tow. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't say goodbye. The only thing he gave me was a final look, like someone carrying a debt he could never repay. I turned away. I didn't need his pity, or his regret. I opened the door, wheeled the suitcases onto the porch, then stepped aside and motioned for them to leave. Rachel stood up, eyes burning with resentment. "You'll regret turning your back on family," she spat. I nodded slightly, hand on the door. "Maybe, but you'll regret mistaking kindness for something to be used." The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, like a seal on a chapter that was no longer mine. I leaned back against it, my knees buckling, but I stayed on my feet. Because I knew if I collapsed now, I wouldn't get up again. In the silence, so thick it buzzed, I could hear only one thing, my heartbeat. Not from love, but from pain. I walked slowly into the living room, looking around the house as if I'd stepped into a stranger's home. Every wall, every chair, still carried the imprint of days I once believed were happy. And now, I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't cry, not right away. The pain was frozen inside me, not yet melted into tears. I simply opened my laptop, went to the website of the law office my friend once recommended, and filled out the divorce consultation form. Each word felt like it was cutting through my skin, but my hands didn't stop. The next morning, while I was making coffee, the phone rang. It was my mother. I thought she was calling to comfort me, or at least to listen. But the first thing she said was, "What did you do, Emily? How could you be so cruel to Rachel?" I froze. The cup in my hand trembled, nearly spilling. "Cruel?" I repeated, voice shaking. "My husband and my sister betrayed me, and I'm the cruel one?" My mother sighed. "But she's pregnant, Emily. She needs a place to stay. And you kicked her out." I wanted to scream into the phone, to ask where that sacred bond of family was when Rachel slept with my husband. But I didn't. I just sat down at the table, gripping the edge hard, steadying my voice. "She's not my sister anymore," I said clearly. "She's a stranger with my blood." My mother started sobbing over the phone, saying I was tearing the family apart. She said my father was furious too. That I should apologize to Rachel, even accept the truth, and learn to forgive. I hung up. Not because I didn't want to explain, but because I finally understood. Some people will never choose to hear your side. That entire day, I didn't leave the house. I didn't turn on the lights. Didn't touch the TV. I just sat in the living room with a cold cup of tea, staring at nothing. I thought about my 8 years with Nathan. Our wedding day, me in white, standing in the golden light of sunset, his promise of forever. And I thought about Rachel, 15 years old, hugging me tight, sobbing when she was bullied at school. Those memories crashed into each other, shattering inside my head. That night, I opened Nathan's suitcase, the one he'd forgotten in the closet. Inside were a few manuscript pages, a notebook, and an old hoodie I'd once given him. I almost threw everything in the trash, but my hands hesitated. Because sometimes, the line between love and fury is just a breath apart. In the end, I packed it all neatly. Left it by the door. To be delivered the next morning, along with the official divorce papers, to my lawyer. I knew I was stepping into a painful journey. Losing a husband, losing a sister, maybe losing a whole family. But I also knew, if I didn't protect myself, no one else would do it for me. From this point forward, I was no longer Emily of us. I was only Emily of myself. Monday morning, I arrived at the law office with a thick envelope in hand. Inside were everything: the marriage certificate, financial statements, photos of the house I owned. My lawyer was a woman in her 50s, sharp eyes, but a surprisingly gentle voice. She didn't ask many questions. Just listened to my story for about 3 minutes before nodding. "Okay," she said. "We'll take care of this fast and clean." When I left her office, the sunlight outside stung my eyes. I didn't know if it was from the brightness, or because my eyes hadn't rested in days. I sat in the car for a few minutes, head resting against the seat, wondering to myself, when did everything I built come crashing down? In just one Sunday afternoon. That evening, I got my first message from Nathan since he left. It wasn't an apology. Not a phone call. Just a short text. "I don't know where to start." I read that line over and over for several minutes, then set the phone down. He didn't need to know where to start, because I had already finished everything. The next day, my mother came to the house. No warning. No asking. Just rang the bell like nothing had ever happened. She stood at the door, holding a bag of groceries like she used to during holidays, her eyes locked onto mine, her voice breaking. "Can you please just hear me out?" I didn't let her in. I stood in the doorway, back straight, face blank. She told me Rachel was staying at a friend's place. No job. No money. Now going to prenatal appointments alone. She said I couldn't turn my back on blood. That I couldn't be so cold to a pregnant woman, especially one carrying her grandchild. I bit my lip hard, trying to stay calm through every word of blame that landed like a ton of bricks. "Do you even know what happened in this house?" I asked, my voice so low it felt unfamiliar, even to me. I gave her a place to stay. I took care of every meal, every dose of medicine, and she repaid me by sleeping with my husband. My mother lowered her head, then looked up, her eyes blurry with tears. "But she's still your sister," she said. I went silent for a few seconds, then responded with a sentence I'll never forget. "No, Mom. She stopped being my sister the moment she crossed the line of trust." I closed the door gently before she could say anything else. Not because I didn't respect her, but because I had to protect myself first. I'd been too generous with my emotions, and that's exactly what had cost me almost everything. That night, I lay in bed, yellow light casting shadows on the ceiling, one hand on my chest, checking if I was still breathing evenly. There was no one beside me asking if I'd eaten, if I'd slept. But I knew, starting now, I wouldn't need anyone to ask. I'd be the one answering those questions for myself. A week after I filed for divorce, strange messages started showing up in my inbox. Not from Nathan, not from Rachel, but from mutual friends, former coworkers, neighbors who'd only seen us a few times at backyard BBQs. Some were checking in. Others said things I never expected. "I heard she had a miscarriage, poor thing. Emily, you shouldn't have kicked your sister out in that condition." I read every word, my hands shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. Rachel was telling the world I was the reason she lost the baby. The same baby she once used as leverage against me. I dropped my head onto my desk, unable to cry. The injustice had crossed a threshold I didn't know existed. I didn't respond to anyone. I knew if I reacted while emotions were still raw, I'd be the villain in everyone's eyes, just as Rachel intended. Instead, I called my lawyer and told her everything. She told me to stay calm. If the pregnancy was real, there'll be proof. If not, the truth will rise, like oil in cold water. 2 days later, Nathan texted me out of the blue. This time it was longer. It even sounded sincere, if I hadn't already known he was a traitor. He said he'd offered many times to go with Rachel to her prenatal appointments, but she always had an excuse. The clinic's too small. No need, it's just a routine scan. The doctor's a man. I feel awkward. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Nathan said that after Rachel claimed she'd had a miscarriage, he started to question everything. He asked to see ultrasound photos, any medical proof at all. But Rachel had nothing. Not a single piece of paper. No appointments ever happened. He said he wasn't writing to beg for forgiveness. He knew he'd destroyed the most precious thing we ever had. He just wanted me to know the truth, so I wouldn't keep suffering from false accusations. You didn't make her lose the baby, he wrote. She was never pregnant to begin with. I set my phone down on the table, eyes wide, staring into nothing. Every cell in my body seemed to stretch open, letting those words echo through me. Suddenly everything became clear, as if someone had flipped the light on in a room I'd been sitting in the dark for weeks. I stepped out onto the porch, into the soft glow of late afternoon sun, and for the first time in days, I took a deep breath without my chest tightening. Rachel had fooled everyone, not just me, but her own parents, her lover, and all the strangers now rushing to defend her. But she couldn't fool the truth, and she couldn't break me with lies. That night, I called my mom. Not to beg, not to argue, just to speak the truth. I'd stayed silent long enough, letting others tell my story the way they wanted. For the first time, I felt the need to reclaim my voice. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was still cold. Emily, I don't have the energy for another fight. I kept my tone steady, words flowing smooth like a quiet lake. I just called to let you know Rachel was never pregnant. Everything she said was a lie. She went silent. Not the exhausted kind, but the kind of silence that happens when your whole world crashes in a second. I told her about Nathan's message, about Rachel's total lack of medical proof, no appointments, no ultrasounds. I didn't throw a pregnant woman onto the street. I threw out a liar, a manipulator, a betrayer. She sighed, a deep, drawn-out sigh that filled the pause between us. Oh God, she whispered, like she didn't even know where to begin. I didn't know. Rachel never told us clearly. We just thought. I cut her off. You believed a story with no proof. But you never asked me, not once. You picked a side without even checking. She apologized, quietly, like someone speaking to a stranger they'd wronged. I didn't say I forgave her because I couldn't. Not yet. I only said, you don't have to defend me. But if you still want to be part of my life, you'll have to learn how to be fair. A few days later, I heard my parents had stopped sending Rachel money. She'd been living off the allowance they secretly wired her every month. And now it was cut off completely. I don't know if it was a late awakening, or just the aftermath of realizing they'd been conned. But I didn't care anymore. I no longer expected fairness from anyone else. Because now I understood, real justice is the kind you claim for yourself. The house was quiet again. No more shouting matches, no more threatening messages or whispers behind my back. I started waking up earlier, sipping coffee on the balcony, watching the sunlight filter through the maple tree in front of the house. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was collapsing inside the moment I opened my eyes. I wasn't happy yet, but I was at peace. And sometimes, peace is the beginning of happiness. After everything, I started rearranging my space. Every drawer, every cabinet corner, every small item. The things Nathan once used, his coffee mug, his old sweater, the fountain pen case on the desk, I gathered them, packed them into a cardboard box, and sealed it shut like I was sealing away a memory. I didn't burn them. I didn't throw them away either. I just needed them out of sight to make room for something else. Maybe a smile, maybe a silence that didn't taste like bitterness. I moved my workspace into the room that used to be Rachel's temporary bedroom. Cleaning that room felt like peeling away layers of dust from a still healing wound. Every corner reminded me of what I'd lost: trust, sisterhood, a sense of safety. But I kept scrubbing, kept organizing, until the room smelled like candles and echoed the sound of keystrokes. No longer a place haunted by someone who saw me as an obstacle to be stepped over. Work became the only anchor I had to hold on to every morning. I got to the office on time, took meetings, signed new contracts, smiled when I had to, and looked like I had it all together. But only I knew that every evening was a quiet war with myself, fighting the emptiness of having no one waiting, no one to share how the day went. I began to write. Not a diary, not a novel, just fragmented notes about how I felt, about the rage of betrayal, the pain of having no one take your side. The sweet but terrifying freedom that comes with having no more ties. I didn't write for anyone else. I wrote to remind myself that I was still here, still breathing, still moving forward. One day, I received an email from a stranger, a woman who had read some of the anonymous posts I'd shared on a forum. She said my story helped her realize she was stuck in a toxic cycle too, one she hadn't had the courage to leave. "The way you stood back up made me believe there's hope," she wrote. I cried, not because of the compliment, but because for the first time in a long while, my pain had turned into something useful for someone else. I didn't reply right away, but I saved the email. I reread it whenever I felt weak. It reminded me I wasn't alone. That even if the people closest to you turn their backs, strangers might still reach out when you fall. Sometimes, I dream about Nathan. In those dreams, he says nothing. He just stands there, watching me walk away. I don't turn back. I wake up in the middle of the night, cold sweat on my back, then switch on the light and breathe deeply a few times. The dreams no longer crush me. They just remind me I made it through. One afternoon, I walked past a little bookstore on the corner and decided to step in. I bought a book about recovering from emotional trauma, and a green olive leather-bound journal. I didn't want to write about the pain anymore. Now, I wanted to write about what comes next. I made a list. Take a pottery class, grow balcony plants, travel solo to Oregon, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting but never dared. I stuck the list on my fridge with a smiley face magnet. And for the first time in a long while, I felt excited about tomorrow. I started dedicating every Sunday morning to myself. No work, no social media, no messages from the past. I'd walk along the lake near my house, where willow trees cast long shadows over the calm water. In the early sunlight, I'd quietly let go of old thoughts like golden leaves drifting onto the surface, letting the breeze carry them away. Once, while standing at my regular coffee shop, I overheard a young couple talking about their wedding plans. The woman laughed brightly as she mentioned a honeymoon in Tuscany. My heart twinged, but then a voice inside me whispered, "That used to be you, and you lived it honestly." I didn't feel envy. I just felt relief, because I had once loved, and I had been brave enough to let go. I kept writing, but this time not about the hurt. I wrote about the lessons, about how to listen to your instincts before they start screaming, about the thin line between kindness and foolishness, about how to rebuild a shelter for your heart after it's been broken from the inside. A small publishing house reached out after one of my posts went viral in a psychology forum. They asked if I'd consider publishing a collection of short memoirs, not formal, just honest. I smiled, not because I was surprised, but because for the first time in my life, I clearly saw, from rubble, you can build something meaningful. My father called me one Thursday afternoon, his voice hoarse like he hadn't slept in days. "Your mother hasn't eaten much the past few days. She feels guilty," he said. No flowery language, no sidestepping like he usually did. "We should have believed you. I'm sorry we didn't sooner." I didn't cry. I didn't say, "I forgive you." I simply said, after a long pause, "I'm okay, but I need time." He understood. I heard a soft exhale on the other end, like someone just let go of a piece of guilt they'd been carrying too long. For the first time in months, I felt genuine remorse from someone close, not out of obligation, but because they finally saw where they had gone wrong. That weekend, I drove to Oregon like I'd planned. I walked along the coastline at Cannon Beach, staring at the towering rocks rising out of the ocean. The sea breeze whipped through my hair, sharp and alive, filled with salt and cold and clarity. I spread my arms, closed my eyes, and let the wind sweep through me, as if it were trying to carry away whatever remnants were left of the old me. When I returned to the hotel, I found an email from Nathan. No subject, no greeting, just one single line. "I hope you find the peace I couldn't give you." I stared at that sentence for a long time, then deleted it. No reply needed. Some stories are meant to end in silence. That evening, I sipped a glass of red wine by the window, watching the distant lights of the small town reflecting on the water. I had once lost everything: love, trust, family. But I also found something more valuable: myself. An old version of me had died, and the woman I was becoming, strong, independent, and quiet, was beginning a new chapter. When I came back from Oregon, spring was just beginning. The maple tree in front of my house was budding with new leaves, and the sparrows had returned to perch on the balcony rail as if winter had never passed. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, my hair falling softly on my shoulders, and I saw someone different, not in appearance, but in presence. I no longer looked away from my own eyes. I finalized the divorce on an ordinary Tuesday. No tears, no fights, no dramatic scene, just a nod to the lawyer, one last signature, and a breath a little longer than usual. On paper, I was single, but in my heart I knew I had never felt this whole or full before. My parents reached out, asking to visit, not to explain or demand anything, just to share a quiet dinner if I'd allow it. I made Southern-style barbecue, my father's favorite, and the salad my mother once taught me to make when I was little. We didn't mention Rachel. We didn't bring up the past. We just shared the food, letting the silence and the river of time carry the rest away. A week later, I got a message from an old friend inviting me to a creative writing workshop. I almost said no, But then I remembered the feeling of typing into the quiet night, when everyone else was asleep, and it was just me, my memories, and my words. I said yes, not to become a writer, but because I didn't want to stay silent anymore. At the workshop, I sat next to a woman a few years older than me, with deep, gentle eyes. When I briefly shared why I was writing, she just nodded, didn't ask questions. But at the end of the session, she handed me a small handwritten note. No one deserves to be broken, but everyone has the power to be reborn. I folded that note, tucked it into my wallet, and have carried it with me ever since. Each morning, I write one line in a green olive leather journal. One thing I'm grateful for, one thing I've learned, and one thing I forgive, even if only partly. I no longer live haunted by why did this happen to me. Instead, I ask, what did it teach me? And strangely enough, when the question changes, so does the heaviness in my heart. I started traveling alone. Short trips to small riverside towns with old bookstores, handmade bakeries, and warm conversations with strangers. No one knew who I was. No one knew I had been betrayed. And no one needed to. I was just a woman, living, breathing, smiling, and that was enough. On my 35th birthday, I threw a small party at home, only inviting those who had truly stayed by my side through it all. When I raised my glass, I didn't thank anyone in particular. I simply said, thank you, to me, for not giving up on myself. There was a moment of silence, and then applause. In that moment, I knew. I hadn't just survived, I had come back to life. And Rachel? I never heard from her again. Maybe she's out there somewhere, staging another performance for a new audience. Maybe not, but it doesn't matter anymore. I don't need justice from her, because I've learned to give it to myself, by moving forward without looking back. I close this chapter not with bitterness, but with peace. No need for a perfect ending, no apologies required, just the quiet knowing that I walked through that pain on my own 2 feet. And from now on, every step I take is mine, free and untouchable.